Today, I'd like to talk a little bit about classical conditioning. But first, let's take a look at one of the most famous experiments in the field of psychology, which was led by Ivan Pavlov. First, a bit about Pavlov. He was a Russian physiologist who is now known best for his work in classical conditioning. Even as a child, he proved himself to be both very intelligent and very passionate for scientific exploration and research. At first, Pavlov was going to follow in his father's footsteps and become a Russian Orthodox priest, but he ultimately decided instead to devote himself to a life of science. In 1904, he won the Nobel Prize for Physiology or Medicine for his extensive research about the digestive system, which made him the first Russian to win a Nobel Prize. Later in life, he shifted his focus from physiology to psychology, conducting the groundbreaking experiments on learning that would earn him a place in history. Okay, so the experiment we're going to discuss today is very famous, and it concerns the drooling of dogs. Like all great experiments, Pavlov started with an interesting observation. He first noticed that every single time you put food in a dog's mouth, the dog would begin to salivate. Okay, so no big deal. It's not particularly insightful. Of course, the dog is going to start drooling when you put food in its mouth. He also noticed, however, that dogs would begin to salivate at the mere sight of their food, or even the sight of just the food dish, or even of the person delivering the food, or even of the sound of the food deliverer's approaching footsteps. Now this was something worth looking into. Pavlov and his assistants attempted to imagine what was going on in the dog's head whenever it began to drool as it anticipated its food. However, these debates didn't lead to any fruitful conclusions. So they decided instead to take a more objective approach and to experiment very precisely. To eliminate any unwanted variables, they isolated the dog in a small room, put it in a harness, and put a device in its mouth that would take its saliva and transport it to an instrument that would measure the quantity of the saliva in cubic centimeters. Now here comes the most famous part of the experiment. Pavlov and the other researchers wanted to see if they could teach the dog to drool in response to stimuli that had nothing to do with its food. Just before placing the food in the dog's mouth, for example, they played a musical tone. After repeating this procedure multiple times, first playing the tone and then putting the food in the dog's mouth, they noticed something remarkable. The dog would begin to drool just at the sound of the tone, even if there was no food in sight. In other words, the dog was conditioned to drool in response to the sound of the tone. This is what classical conditioning is all about. We take a neutral stimulus, something that normally wouldn't make us respond in any notable way, just like the dog wouldn't normally start drooling in response to a musical note, and we can train an animal to respond to it. Thus, we transform the neutral stimulus into a conditioned stimulus, or a learned stimulus, which in turn produces a conditioned response, or a learned response. By the way, Pavlov and his fellow researchers tried conditioning the dog to drool at other stimuli, including a buzzer, a light, a tap on the leg, and even the sight of a circle, and they were successful every single time. Now, you might be wondering, well, what's the real-world application here? You might be surprised, actually, to discover what an impact the principles established in Pavlov's experiments have on our own lives as human beings. While we don't have much of a need to train ourselves to drool at the sound of a bell, we can learn a lot about ourselves and our tendencies by generalizing the results of Pavlov's experiments. Like the dog in the experiment, we human beings can be classically conditioned, for better or for worse. Let's start with a more positive example. Maybe you remember your parents teaching you as a little kid to say please whenever you wanted something. Often parents will refuse to give their child what they've asked for until they say please. In this way, the child learns that he will only receive what he wants if he makes sure to say please. As the child repeats the process of saying please and of receiving what he wants over and over again, he is classically conditioned to say please before asking for anything. In this way, he has been taught an important part of having good manners. Now let's move to a more negative example of classical conditioning, one that I find slightly more intriguing and a little bit less obvious. One of the biggest things that drug counselors will tell their clients, who are former drug users, is to stay away from people or settings that might re-trigger their craving for drugs. The interesting thing here is that while the parents teaching their child to say please in the previous example were very deliberately conditioning their child to be polite, Former drug users certainly weren't trying to condition themselves to feel a craving for drugs around certain people or in different settings. The process sort of just happened on its own. As the drug user took drugs with the same people or in the same place time and time again, he began to unconsciously associate those people or that place with the taking of the drugs. Eventually, it probably just felt natural to him to take drugs when he was in that familiar setting, just like it eventually seemed natural to the child to say please whenever he requested something. Recognizing this phenomenon, drug counselors inform their clients not to revisit those people or those places where they've been conditioned to want to take drugs. Avoiding settings where we have unwittingly conditioned ourselves to do something that we don't want to do is one solution to this kind of problem. Another solution takes a more direct approach, eliminating the conditioned response. In other words, we can untrain ourselves to do something. For example, let's say you've been super afraid of taking a bath ever since you slipped and broke your arm in the bathtub when you were a kid. That is to say, you've been conditioned to feel fear whenever you walk into the bathtub to take a bath because you remember this horrible incident that happened to you. The interesting thing is, as long as you keep having safe, successful baths after this incident, and you don't slip and break your arm again, you will eventually get rid of the fear you've conditioned yourself to have. Each time you take a bath without any problems occurring, you'll feel a little less nervous about taking a bath the next time because you'll remember that everything went fine the last time. After enough successful baths, the conditioned response of fear that you used to have whenever you walked into the bathtub will disappear, and you won't feel any fear in this context anymore. This process of getting rid of a conditioned response is known as extinction. I think the important thing to recognize here is that we as human beings are more affected by our environment and by our experiences than we often realize. Sometimes without knowing it, we've been conditioned to feel a certain emotion or to act a certain way whenever we face a particular situation. Sometimes this classical conditioning is a good thing, but sometimes it's not. And in the cases where it's not a good thing, we should try to be aware of how we've been conditioned, as well as how we can uncondition ourselves. After all, there's no need for our lives to be dominated by a psychological phenomenon that is ultimately in our hands to control.